I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Good morning. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. I'm Jared Ball. As always, thanks again for joining me and for joining us. And please make sure you're subscribed here at this channel. And of course, consider joining. And I will be announcing very soon a new journalism collaborative media project that I think is going to enhance what we've been trying to do here and only make things stronger. So your support will not certainly go in vain, and it is certainly not an individual supportive endeavor. So please at least consider that, or at least subscribe so you're made aware of when we post something new. And more importantly, even, I think you should be subscribed at imixwhatilike.org, because as the full website hub, you get, alerted whenever I or my colleagues do something in a variety of multimedia beyond these live streams. So, and of course you get alerted for these as well. So it's sort of a win-win. We have a lot more coming up in terms of political prisoners, about, we want to keep focused on them and supportive of them. Please go back, if you haven't already, and check the interview I did the other day with Sophia Elijah about the Free Sundiata Acoli campaign, and spread that video around. We need more support for him. And then please also check out another recent interview we did with Dr. Karanja Carroll about the slogan Asada taught me, going beyond that slogan, which is again also at this channel and at imixwhatilike.org. So yeah, please do all consider that. And then of course today is the day people are celebrating in terms of a holiday, Dr. King. Please go check the video I did the other day about state suppression and branding and the national commercial press and what has been done to his image, both while he was alive and certainly posthumously. So that something to supplement your celebration or commemoration of Dr. King by reminding a little bit of who he actually was, where he was headed politically, why he was a threat to the state, why he's been subsequently rebranded, commemorated, etc., by those who politically despised him, and what that might mean for people trying to organize and build today. All right, so thank you for indulging all that. Please check and share all of that as well. But right now, I want to turn in a slightly different direction, although, well, in many ways, it's not necessarily a different direction, but maybe a different way of approaching a lot of the topics that we've been dealing with here at I Mix What I Like and just beyond over the last couple of decades. And we have a classic interview, if not more than one, with our next guest at imixwhatilike.org. But so it's always a pleasure to have him back. And of course, I'm talking about Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum, who, among many things, is a licensed psychologist and holds the diplomat in a diploma, I believe, or maybe a typo, unless there's something else that I'm not aware of, in clinical psychology. He is a founder, a former director, and now training consultant to the Behavioral Medicines and Anxieties Disorders Clinic at the University of Massachusetts Health Services in Amherst, Massachusetts. He is certified in biofeedback and is a senior fellow in the National Association for Applied Psychophysiology and Biofeedback. His areas of experience are in psychosomatic medicine, clinical hypnosis, and individual psychotherapy. He has recently entered private practice in Hadley, Massachusetts at the Brain Analysis and Neurodevelopment Center, focusing on biofeedback, psychosomatic medicine, and psychotherapy. He is the author of 6 books in psychology and 3 in poetry. His most his most recent books in psychology include The African Unconscious and The Dark Light Consciousness, Melanin, Serpent Power, and the Luminous Matrix of Reality. His last volume of poetry, Chronicles of the Pig and Other Delusions, won the National 2010 Naomi Long Madget Poetry Award. Dr. Bynum received the Abraham H. Maslow Award from American Psychological Association for an outstanding and lasting contribution to the exploration of the farther reaches of the human spirit. Dr. Bynum is married, the father of 2 sons, and a 30-year practitioner of Kundalini yoga. So without further ado, Dr. Bynum, welcome again to the program. It's good to have you back with us, and good morning. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here during these weird, strange, bizarre times politically we're living through. And yet, in many ways, it is something that our lives and fates and destinies have been moving toward for a long time. Clearly, even the most recent attempted coup of the government cannot stop the deeper currents that we're talking
about. Well, I almost want to start there. What, just by simply asking, what do you mean? What is it that you're saying has not been stopped or could not be stopped by whatever people are calling happened last week?
Well, I may be, I'm surely in the minority in this perspective, but for me, this has been a struggle that's been going on in the Western world since at least the last half millennium, 1492. What do I mean by that? 1492 was a very big year in world history and certainly in the West. Specifically for Europe and Africa, in 1492, the last African emperor, Sunni Ali, died. The Jews were kicked out of Spain, and Columbus fumbled and found his way into the Americas. It was a revolutionary change. And the slave trade, a short time after that, the African slave trade in particular, began big time. And we saw a movement of Africans here in the Western world, although we Africans had been here before that time, and such large numbers came. And then we went through a period of chattel slavery, quote, emancipation, after being in the antebellum South, and then for the last 100+ years have been fighting a war in the United States to gain human freedom. And from my point of view, and I acknowledge I'm in a minority in this, I think the most recent and still present administration was one of the last gasps of white dominance and supremacy in the Western world. And his attempt at a coup d'etat that failed, but it was an attempt at a coup d'etat, was the last major attempt to suppress African peoples in the Western world. And so that's what I meant by the deeper currents, because one of the things that we're going to be talking about now is the deeper currents of human consciousness. And the deeper currents of human consciousness are rooted in their African origin, the African unconscious, and it dwells in all human beings, because Africa is the home of the human species and the deepest level of all of our minds. I don't care, you can be Swedish, Chinese, Japanese, Kenyan, South American, whatever. The deeper currents of all humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, the collective unconscious, is rooted in the African template, biologically, genetically, anthropologically, and also historically. And that has not been stopped, even though there are many people who resist that. That is coming now to be recognized in science itself. So that's what I meant, is not been able to stop that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought of even, in fact, the first question I have written here for you is to ask you to talk about what you describe as spiritual sciences, because admittedly, for people like me who struggle with the immaterial, and for people like me who often want to claim that our revolutionary activity is strictly and almost exclusively rooted in the material, the way you approach this has always been very compelling to me. And when initially, and even still, I struggle even with that phrase and what appears to be a contradiction in the phrase spiritual science. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and why maybe people who are encouraged to approach the world as I have been might need to just, work a little harder to overcome some of these developed barriers?
Well, when you say spiritual sciences, you're absolutely right that they are developed barriers. And they've only been developed barriers in the last 250 or so years, and primarily in the Western world. Prior to that time, there was no major separation between what was thought of as science and what was thought of as the spiritual realm. I mean, in ancient Kemetic Egypt, they didn't draw any distinction. You could be an astronomer, a priest at the same time. There was no separation there. And in point of fact, some of the major figures in Western science, have both been profoundly scientific people, obviously, but also have a deep spiritual current. We just lop that part of their history off. People forget that Isaac Newton, the formulator of the early laws and understandings of celestial gravity, was also an avid researcher of astrology. People forget that. People forget that William James, the quote father unquote of modern psychology, in addition to formulating many of the precepts of modern contemporary experimental psychology, believed very much in seances, life after death, communication with the spirit realm, and mediums. We forget all of that. We just, we separate, we segregate the physical sciences from the spiritual sciences. Well, that's becoming more and more untenable, because as we move down in science to not only the atomic level, but the level below that, the quantum level, and even the subquantum level, i.e., below the atom, we find that most of it is immaterial. Most of it is empty space. It's immaterial. Most of the universe is made up of things that are immaterial, that we don't see. 90+% of the universe that we know of is composed of something called dark matter, and yet we don't see it. We know it indirectly from our instruments. It bends gravity. It focuses light. It keeps the solar systems together, but it's invisible. It's immaterial. And to add insult to injury, your mind and my mind is immaterial. Our brains aren't, but the big secret is that the mind and the brain are not identical. They relate to each other, clearly. They interact with each other, clearly. But we've had, for close to 60 years now, studies in what's called near-death experience, where people clinically die. Heart's gone, heart rate's gone, beating is gone. Brain waves are flat. You, for all intents and purposes, are dead. And yet, when they're revived, they have conscious experiences. So we are conscious before we are born, and we are conscious after our physical death. I mean, people may be assuming that once you get born, that's when you become conscious. No. The baby, an infant, is not born and then becomes conscious. They are conscious in their mother's womb for some period of time. We don't know how long, but they're conscious in their mother's womb. And we know from near-death studies that the human mind is conscious, sentient, for some period after clinical death. So we are conscious before we're born for some period of time, and we're conscious after we are physically dead for some period of time. And so, sorry to inform folks, but consciousness is the primary reality, and matter is secondary. Matter is epiphenomena. And quantum mechanics proves that experimentally hundreds and thousands of times. So that is the new world where we are entering. And yet that world is ancient. That world was studied in ancient Kemetic Egypt. And they developed not only philosophies about it, but they also developed methodologies for exploring that. Methodologies that are empirical, that can be tested. And they had a whole civilization and culture based upon that. You know, folks tend to think that Egypt has 3 pyramids and that they were the tombs of the pharaohs on the Giza plateau. No, there've never been any bones found in the pyramids. They were chambers of initiation into the solar mysteries, into the deep solar mysteries, where people learned how to do things that in today's psychology and psychiatry we refer to as dissociation, as out of body experience, as um, what is euphemistically been called astral experiences of one kind or another. But the point is that these are phenomena, psychological and psychiatric phenomena, that you can induce in the clinical office. You can induce it with certain kind of medication, but you can also induce it by going into certain trance states. Okay? And this has been experimentally, I want to underline the word experimentally proved hundreds of times. It's just that people don't know what to do with the data. They just don't know what to do with the data, so we ignore it. Well, this is coming to a crashing end. And I'm trying to gently say that many of the methodologies developed in the African world, particularly ancient Kemetic Egypt, but also West Africa, are here. And these methodologies are well known. Now, we're usually taught to be afraid of them and to leave them alone. We are. We're taught, they're called, quote, the dark sciences, unquote. And so therefore, that's good propaganda, because that means you won't study it. But if you relabel it and reframe it, then certain religious experiences and ceremonies in the West African spiritual rites of many of the earth religions, Buddhism being only one of them, and many others, they are forms of conscious dissociation and communion with other forms of energy out there in the world. And it's a matter of how to do it. And I'm trying to say that in many of the African traditions, in particular, there are methodologies, proven methodologies for doing this. And we have to get our head around that. And I'm addressing that to not only to folks of European background, but I'm also addressing that to folks of African background, because you'd be surprised at how many people of African descent actively suppress or are afraid of these kind of phenomena. And I'm trying to say, as a psychologist, that this is normal. It's not weird. It's just different, but it's been with us for thousands of years, and we need to turn around and embrace it and see what we can learn from it. Not only in terms of medicine and psychology and psychiatry, but also in terms of what you referred to earlier as, quote, the spiritual sciences, unquote. And again, the spirit has only been abstracted and dissociated from matter in the minds of the Western and the modern world in the last 200 years. Prior to that time, sorry, no split. You can do both. No contradiction.
Dr. Bynum, and first of all, I appreciate what Leah is saying here, because for those of us, well, one thing, first of all, a shout out to S.E. Ramu, who years ago put me in touch with your work and had you created or set up the original, at least one, if not several multiple interviews that we did with you a couple of years ago via our radio show. But one of the things that he points out also that I always like to echo is that it is one thing to read someone's work and it's another to study someone's work, and they're not the same thing. So in this case, several of us may have read one or two of your books, but to get the chance to in some way dialogue or hear from you and further explanation is, I think, important. And not maybe quite studying, but in a step up.
Well, there's a quality that, and I notice it in myself, certainly, but there's a quality that is quite different when you hear someone speaking about whatever and you actually are reading it. Take something that's very close to me, and that is poetry in the arts. I mean, I like certainly reading poetry. I certainly do. But more than that, I like hearing it. Because when I hear it, I pick up the tonality and the inflection and the energy and the spirit behind the speaker and the reader, and that to me is invaluable as someone who's engaged in that form of artistic expression. Well, the same thing is true in writing and reading books. So much so that um, the last book that I was able to fortunately get published, called Dark Light Consciousness, Melanin, Serpent Power, and the Luminous Matrix of Reality. I mean, I acknowledge that I didn't hold back in that book. I put everything out there. I put it out there. I'm at this point, uh, I'm too old to be worried about tenure or what the majority of my colleagues may think. I know why I'm here, and so I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. Well, that book has surprisingly done quite well, and enough so that we've made it, the press made it into an audio book. So a person can now listen to it. And just like we're picking up things now in our conversation back and forth with each other, it's the same with the audiobook. You can hear it. You can go, what? Let me say that again. Boom. Oh, right. And you pick up things that are not immediately available on the page. So hearing things is very important to me. I can testify to that. And I'm going to continue to press things as long as I have energy and voice with me.
Right on.
Recently, we have, it'll be out later on this spring or summer, I believe. I took one of my books called The African Unconscious, Roots of Ancient Mysticism and Modern Psychology, and I took it back because another press was very interested in it. And so I took it back from the other press that it was kind of lounging in, and I greatly expanded it and put in some areas that had come to me since it was first published, which was back in 1999, actually, just in the cusp of the millennium. And I've been keeping notes ever since that time, hoping that someday, who knows, maybe it'll be reissued. Well, it was, and greatly expanded in areas. So now it's going to be released as Our African Unconscious, the Black Origins of Mysticism and Psychology. And it is what I hope will be a contribution to our ongoing reemergence and ascendance as not only an individual people of African descent, but as the progenitors of the human species itself. Again, remember, the origin of all human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, thinking man, Homo sapiens sapiens, is rooted in Africa, particularly the South and the East Coast of Africa. For millions of years developed it, for millions of years. And eventually developed into Homo sapiens sapiens that then left Africa and populated the rest of the world. And that started happening about 120,000, around 100,000 years ago or so. But I want to emphasize this point, that so-called racial diversification, in other words, looking at the different types of looking people that we have today, the indigenous African peoples, called indigenous African peoples. Well, within that, there are at least 5 different types. Not all African peoples look the same. There are 5 different, just like there are ethnic groups in Europe, there are ethnic groups in Africa. There are ethnic groups in Asia. But underneath them is the template. And the surface, the template is the same. The surface differentiation phenotypical differences only began about 30,000, 35,000 years ago. Up until that time, everybody looked black, even those who migrated to Europe. Recently, the anthropologists unearthed a skeleton and a figure from England from about 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago. He had blue eyes, but everything else about him was black.
Hmm.
Because phenotypically, that only began to happen about 35-ish thousand years ago through, adaptation to local climate changes and so on and so forth. The eyes get bluer because it's more adaptive in foggy territories. The hair gets longer in order to retain body heat. A lot of phenotypical changes happen, but those are all surface. The deep structure of the human brain, the human mind, the unconscious is an African genius creation. We're all Africans, whether people like it or not. And the sooner we can recognize that, the better we can move on. It doesn't imply any kind of superiority. It does not. You're not necessarily superior. A child is not necessarily, a parent is not necessarily biologically superior to their children. They're just their parents. Okay? So let's get that one out of the way, folks.
Dr. Bynum, because I do want to come back to some of that, but there's one other sort of segue question I wanted to ask, because it comes up all the time. But when you make reference to a past that in some ways was, it sounds almost like you're saying intellectually or philosophically superior or more advanced. Wouldn't people be encouraged or inclined now or today to say, well, that can't be correct because we're moving in a linear progressive path as humanity from old to new, better to worse, dumber to smarter. So in other words, when people hear you say, once upon a time there was no division between the immaterial and the material. Wouldn't we be inclined to say that well, that's because we didn't know any better then? Will people also believe that thunder was God bowling, or not bowling, but clapping, or lightning was some other?
Those are anthropomorphic. Those are anthropomorphic personifications of energies and forces, and part of us needs to do that to make it feel close to us. And from a certain point of view, it is a sort of a simple but useful way to sort of apprehend things. But as far as being superior, I don't think so. We have been essentially the same creature for the last at least 150,000 years. If you were able to, somehow a child from Kenya fell off of Mount Kilimanjaro into some ice pit or something. I'm making this up, and was immediately frozen, like the woolly mammoths. And our technology was able to thaw them out and bring them back to life from 100,000 years ago. Go to school, get educated, she could still fly a spaceship.
But what I'm saying is not just physically, but you were almost suggesting that humanity in some ways knew more about the universe, or more about the power of humanity beyond the material that we do now. In other words,
I am saying that. I'll say that. I'll go out on a limb and say that. But it's a different kind of knowledge set. It doesn't mean it is necessarily superior. It means that the knowledge that's explored is different. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll give you a concrete technical example of that. We don't know here in this part of the world very much about uh, the objective state of the dream. Many people believe that, including Carl Jung, great psychologist, psychiatrist, that the unconscious was not just simply some figment of our minds that didn't exist. He believed that the unconscious was objective. That's why he talked about the collective unconscious. Some people not only believe, but have a technology for exploring the dream state as a real and active dimension. And I'm referring to the indigenous Aboriginal peoples. And so they have a technology for entering into the dream state and then using it objectively in their environment for hunting and other kinds of things. We don't know how to do that, but they know how to do it. But they don't build airplanes either, or tanks, or computers. But their knowledge set goes in a different direction. And all I'm trying to say is we have all these different areas of knowledge that different peoples of the earth have developed and cultivated. We should proceed with it. In many parts of the world, particularly certain places in India, Dravidian India, southern India, and Tibet, they have developed very sophisticated ways to deal with the life energy, referred to as Kundalini. The ancient Kemetic Egyptians referred to it as the Uraeus. But the point is, it is an energy in the body, and they've developed methodologies and techniques for dealing with it that raise that energy to the to higher levels in the human mind and brain. We don't do that much here in the Western world, and we even doubt many times that it even exists because we can't put it in a test tube. And yet, most of the world is not in a test tube. Most of the things that you and I believe in most fervently are invisible. When's the last time you measured some love in a cup? And yet you're willing to die for it. I don't know if that many people are willing to die for a chemical formula. Right? But I know a lot of people are willing to die for the immaterial, i.e. love, beauty, joy, intimacy. These are the things that people are willing to sacrifice themselves all the way for. And they are immaterial. So, what?
No, I hear you. Dr. Bynum, since we're about 30 plus minutes in, I think this is a good way to point to try to ask you about some of the specifics of your work. You know, in the title of the book that you were just talking about, you have words like serpent and melanin. Yeah. You talked about already some of what you mean about some of what you talk a little. You've already talked a little bit about the political differences in phenotype versus what they mean actually biologically.
Yes.
But at the same time, you do talk about what are, I think, biological terms like melanin and neuromelanin.
Yes.
I definitely want to have you talk about everything as much as about the book as possible. But could we start there? What do you mean when you start talking about the value and the power of melanin and neuromelanin?
Right.
What exactly are you talking about? And what
well,
are
it's primarily begins as a biological phenomenon. In the mother's womb, after the egg and the sperm come together to create the beginnings of life, which, by the way, are a quantum mechanical, a spark of energy, quantum of energy, the quantum potential, it's called. And the life in the womb begins. It begins as a black dot, okay, and then it begins to elongate in the mother's womb. This is the journey of embryogenesis in the mother's womb. Well, that current of light is directed by an unusual current, electromagnetic current and the chemical is melanin. Why melanin? This is a universe for everybody. Got nothing to do with race. Why melanin? Because melanin has the capacity it absorbs light. It absorbs quanta. It absorbs light and quanta, and it transduces it, translates it into higher levels of manifestation. That's just embryogenesis. And then it does that completely, more progressively more complex ways in the mother's womb. And so that's how a fetus elongates and evolves. And it involves that little spinal line that becomes the spinal cord, the brain, and all of that is directed by melanin. Okay, and it works and it's an expression of evolution, of biology and evolution in the mother's womb. And very critically, it is how the nervous system, the human nervous system, develops, such that now, when you and I are speaking, the surface of our brains, underneath the skull, where no sunlight gets to it, the surface of the brain is gray and dark. Why? Because it absorbs light and it translates light into more complex forms. The innermost lining of the spinal cord is that neural material of neuromelanin. Neuro simply means melanin of the brain and nervous system. That's all it means, neuro. And as we know, many spiritual methodologies all around the world are about raising the energy along the spinal line up into the brain. One form is obviously different forms of yoga, but if you practice Tai Chi, if you practice many spiritual disciplines that emanate from West Africa or South Africa, it is about awakening that energy at the base of the spine and bringing her up progressively, safely and progressively, until she reaches the brain. And if you don't think that you implicitly buy into that, when you go to a physician's office, sometimes on the door or the outside of the building, there is a symbol, a medical caduceus. And what is it? It is a pole, and it has two serpents that coil 7 times around it until it reaches the top of the pole, where it then sprouts wings and takes flight. That comes from the ancient Kemetic Egyptian temple mysteries, where they awakened that energy along the spine, and when it successfully reached the top of the skull, the top of the brain, one was spiritually transformed and one took spiritual flight.
But Dr. Bynum, that cannot possibly be correct, because we are all told, and it is still even said to this day, that that is a Greek symbol that all started with
Hermes, right?
And the Hippocratic.
Right. Where do you think Hermes got it from? What do you think the Hermetic principles? The Hermetic principles came out of Kemetic Egypt.
Wait, Greece didn't just emerge out of the nothingness on its own, out of its own?
No, apparently not. Apparently they had a history of their own. Apparently they had a history of their own, and in point of fact, they even said so. The Greeks were not racist. The Greeks were not racist. They acknowledged their debt to Kemet. Kemet was like the graduate school. That's where you went to study advanced medicine. Same with the Romans. You know, if you want to study medicine, there was their stuff, but if you really wanted to do it in depth, you went to ancient Egypt, and that's where you got your education. Because Egypt had been a civilization for 6,000 years before the rise of Greece and Rome. Yes. So, and it's called the Hermetic symbol. Okay, well, that's where it came from, and it doesn't mean that you literally lift it up and your physical body floated around. No, obviously not. It meant that psychically you reached a certain point, and then you were able to, what we call today in psychology and psychiatry, dissociate into a more luminous experience of yourself. Right, and that is consonant with some of the principles of quantum mechanics. It says the base of the world process is light. The base of the world process is not physical matter. It is energy and light, quanta.
By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I have to, almost if for no other reason, because I know that my students who will end up seeing this have been greatly impacted by some of the mythologizing around what I think you just said. But this is, because a lot of what I think you just described is often talked about today in the context of the Illuminati. as this political conspiracy,
Right.
but it
Right.
does have origins in this luminous process that you're
Yes, it
talking
does.
about. Has, like many of the other things you're talking about, been mythologized and
That's right.
rebranded into something else.
Lots of things can be corrupted. A lot of things can be corrupted, and uh, the Illuminati is a very controversial kind of thing. But I want to keep it to the biological and medical basis and origin of it. And its biological basis is based upon events, not events, processes that occur in embryogenesis of mother's womb. They can be duplicated in certain kind of physical and spiritual experiences of one kind or another. And there's no ultimate separation between the two. Again, that supposed separation between real science and real spirituality is a superimposition that has been with us only for the last 300 or so years. Prior to that time, there was no separation between the two. You could get into trouble for pushing one or the other, that's for sure. But those were political issues.
Mm-hmm.
Those are political and religious issues. But that was not about anything of substance in doing that. And again, right now, the leading theories of physics, of quantum mechanics, relativity, string theory, posit that beneath the physical world of matter is the world of energy. Energy. And energy is neither created nor destroyed, but infinitely transformed. Energy, quanta, the sea of light energy. These are all physicalistic phenomena that are about non-material phenomena. It's not that there's nothing that you can measure in physical. That's true. It is, but it's not like this desk. And many people confuse that with ultimate reality, and it's far from it. You know, we are in we're taking this particular slice of time that we're in, and we're assuming the Western world will always be this way. Well, it wasn't this way before. You know, and ubiquitous things at one time disappeared another. I mean, can you imagine a world where there are no computers? And yet, 100 years ago, there were no computers. It's quite possible that in another 100 years, there won't be anything called computers anymore. They'll be replaced by something else. But we have a difficult time imagining that because we assume that it must be what's happening right now. So that's the arrogance of our time. And I'm suggesting a little more humility. A little more humility.
It is weird. Sometimes I do think about that. You know, my own grandmother watched the arrival of the car,
Right.
the certainly the popularization of the telephone.
Yes.
I mean, you know, all of that stuff didn't exist when she was born. So
No.
I mean, it's anyway. You make a good point there. There's so much, you know, you talk about time, and I am mindful of how we have been taught to define it and categorize it. And we are, you know, heading towards 1 hour. I don't know exactly how much time you have, but I want to, because I see, you know, shout out to the people in the chat. And the comments have been hilarious and vigorous. But there's so much more to get to that, you know, I know we obviously can't, but I did want to raise, you know, you mentioned Jung, you've mentioned Sigmund Freud, and in your book, you talk a little bit, at least in the one book where at least that I've mostly read and become familiar with, and about which we're sort of talking here. You talk a little bit about the limitations of the Western approach, and even as much as they've contributed, Freud and Jung were themselves limited in what their own studies would conclude. So I would want you to say a little bit about that, but both of them, if I'm not mistaken, I'm leading us to, I want to raise a question that comes from my brother S.E. Ramu. Again, shout out to him for originating all of this. But if I'm not mistaken, both Jung and Freud, for maybe, I don't know, different reasons, different purposes, or different different effect, engaged in the use of drugs, for lack of a better word. And the question that is being asked here is what will the impact of psychedelics be in psychiatric practice, particularly with Black clients? And are there trainings for Black psychiatrists in the metabolism of the psychedelics within African people? There's at least one African-American male participant in the Johns Hopkins clinical work. How will oxytocin presence in African-American women modulate their experience in metabolizing psychedelics like psilocybin? Anyway, there's a lot there, but in other words, in adapting this question of what Freud and Jung did and didn't do and missed out on in terms of their limitations, and then the specifics of psychedelic psychiatric work with African populations. I don't know. Well, I was trying to build a bridge there. Now,
well, I hear what you're saying. I hope I hear what you're saying.
Sure.
Let me say first, I only have very limited knowledge of the impact of psychedelic medications and drugs on they're more directly related to African populations. Mm-hmm. And it's a controversial area, and there's some significant evidence to indicate that certain drugs that have flooded the market have had a negative bonding effect on melanin and neuromelanin in the brain. That as far as melanin in the body have more negatively affected African population. But again, it's a very controversial area. There's a book called by Carol Barnes. I forget the name of Melanin and something. And also a book by Richard D. King that explore that in more detail. But again, my knowledge of that area is limited. Okay. What I do have more familiarity with is the fact that both Jung and Freud acknowledged the African origin of psychology in many ways. Carl Jung's ideas came from an African scholar, St. Augustine, a long time ago, and some other contributors. And he came up with the idea and called it collective unconscious. And in point of fact, he spent time in Africa trying to explore this. In fact, Jung, I think he was traveling in Uganda, was looking out the window one time, and that's it, the book, Melanin, The Chemical Key to Black Greatness. It's a good book, research book, folks. But Jung looked out the window of the train, and he saw this African youth sitting on a mountaintop, and he had a flash of intuition. And he said, "That's me." He knew on some deep level that was his origin. And he didn't say it directly because he's not going to say, back in those times, say I'm an African. He wasn't crazy. That would have ruined his career. But he acknowledged it, and he actually came to the United States to study African Americans in reference to the collective unconscious. He called it the collective unconscious. Freud did not. Freud referred to deep memories of phylogenetic origin, i.e., ancestral and deeper origin, as the racial memory. Okay, and Freud's office was littered with African and African Egyptian statues of one kind or another. And Freud's most denigrated book was called Moses and Monotheism, because you can tell he's deeply ambivalent and scared about saying this. But Freud came out and said essentially that Moses, the creator of the Jewish form of religion, was not a Jew at all, but a black Egyptian priest. Freud said that. And the Jewish community, which loved Freud up until that time, went silent. They didn't know what to say about it. And the only people that loved that book were the Nazis. Okay, so they both acknowledged it in their own way, but they could.
And some African historians appreciated it too, because the book is what Freud says in it. He says his attempt to offer an analysis of what happens to the group, in this case Jews, who learn that their foundational myth is in fact false.
Right.
What can happen to the whole group psychologically?
Yes.
So,
And
anyway, yeah. Anyway,
well, but just to leave that subject on, but uh, 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 Jews in the United States are deeply ambivalent about that whole area because on a deep level they know that part of their origin is in Africa, and every year in the Passover ceremony there is a reading of the Haggadah, and it says, "In Egypt did Israel become a nation."
mm-hmm.
Okay, and if you look closely, they snuck in. If you look closely at movies, even like the Ten Commandments, when the Jews are leaving Egypt, they're all mixed in with the black population.
Mm-hmm.
Watch it next time. So there's all of this stuff going on in there.
Well, people pointed out everything that happens in the Bible is right in Africa, or
that's right,
so,
and including the description of the luminous avatar of Jesus the Christ himself. In Revelations, I think it's chapter 16, 17, I think, but in Revelations, he's described as uh, hair like sheep's wool,
yeah,
and skin the color of bronze.
Burnt bronze is the verb.
Right, burnt bronze.
Burnt
Now,
bronze.
he would have difficulty today. Okay, but it's right there in the Bible.
Oh yeah, he didn't stop.
You get these people who want to interpret the Bible literally. Mm-hmm. That's totally okay. That's philosophically cool. That's religiously fine. They interpret it directly, particularly some of the white fundamentalists. They get to that part, and all of a sudden it's a symbolic. It doesn't mean what it says. It's symbolic.
Oh, the comments in the chat are just it's too good. It's too good. I shout out to all the comics and the haters in the chat. This is great. Dr. Bynum, just quickly, I want to, if you could come back to I want to I don't know if we were clear on this enough. I'd like to. What is, when you talk about melanin and neuromelanin, what are the differences between the two? And then
right.
What are the roles that each are playing?
Okay.
In the processes you're talking about.
Okay. Yes, that's a very important question because unfortunately there's been a lot of misinformation from my point of view about these two. Melanin, first of all, begins the epic journey of embryogenesis in a mother's womb for everybody, and that includes the other primates. Okay, and it guides the development of embryological unfoldment. And once we're out of the womb, it becomes important in terms of the surface of the body, because depending on the climate and the environment you're in, you need a certain amount of that in order to protect you. Like there are very few albinos in Africa. Why? Because very light skin over the generations makes one much more susceptible to the ultraviolet light of the sun, and it causes cancers of various forms. So you don't have it. But as the African populations moved into Europe over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, they phenotypically surface adapted to it. Okay, so it's a surface phenomenon. It has got nothing to do with intelligence. Nothing to do with supposed superiority. Okay, and in fact, melanin on the surface can be variable from person to person within the same family. Right? You might have a brother or sister who's lighter or darker skin than you, and there are all kinds of, I know about that, all kinds of familial dynamics, cultural this, blah blah blah. We all know about that. Okay, and has a long history in the United States, and that's a whole other show. But the point is, it's about the surface. Neuromelanin is brain melanin, and that's different, and that's a more constant, and that's a more universal. There are no significant known differences in neuromelanin in the brain between the populations of Sweden, South Africa, China, India. Anyway, that is a different phenomenon, and I hope folks can hear that, because there's been so much distortion about that. Okay, and neuromelanin is the one that is responsible for the absorption of light and quanta and the transmutation of that into higher forms of vibration in the human nervous system. Okay, that is the process of evolution. Is the transformation of energy and light into intelligence and expression, at least in our human embodiment. Okay, and what I tried to do, especially in dark light consciousness, was to detail that in some degree of medical and biological detail. And some folks argued that I spent too much time documenting this, but I needed people to know that this is based in science and medicine. This isn't some off the wall kind of stuff. It's real, and there's nothing to be afraid of. Whether you are whatever race, ethnic group you believe you belong to, this is your common inheritance. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to be afraid. It's nothing about superiority, inferiority, none of that stuff. That obscures it. My emphasis was on what the implications are, also in terms of our contemplative, meditative disciplines and techniques and methodologies, because that's where my interest is. And has a profound effect and involvement in our experiences of prayer, meditation, contemplation, and the spiritual disciplines of various kinds, from Taoism to yoga to the technologies and disciplines of conscious absorption, what other people call possession, quote unquote. These are when you call it possession, you've immediately framed it in such a way that people are afraid. How many movies have you seen about ancient Egypt in which they immediately bring out a mummy who's going to get you?
It's the only version of ancient Egypt that we see, unless Elizabeth Taylor is in it.
Right, but it's always about some mummy who's going to do you damage and get you and hurt you and so on and so forth. And so therefore people are kept frightened. In point of fact, the ancient Kemetic Egyptians had a deep philosophy of death as initiation. Death as initiation into a wider frame of mind and consciousness, which a point of view which, by the way, is perfectly at home with quantum mechanics and certain aspects of relativity theory. Okay, and that's what I tried to outline in Dark Light Consciousness. So,
Dr. Bynum, we have a question here that is similar to the one I asked. A shout out to Africans Arise. Has it been confirmed that darker skinned people have higher concentrations of neuromelanin?
Absolutely not. Not that I'm aware of.
And this is sort of the point.
This may be the area that the person may be concerned about. One of the areas in which there are differences, biological differences, between different larger ethnic racial groups, so-called racial groups, is in terms of what's called pineal gland calcification. The pineal gland sits between the two hemispheres of the brain, buried deeper in the surface of the brain. And in point of fact, over evolution, the pineal gland, which is light sensitive, by the way, referred to, quote, as a, quote, third eye, unquote, is light sensitive, has descended deeper into the brain than the skull and the brain over the course of evolution. So the earlier reptilian forms had that eye closer to the surface of their brain. Through the mammalian development and so forth, it has gone deeper and deeper, but it is still there and it is sensitive to light. Well, from Western philosophers, Rene Descartes, he developed the whole Cartesian mind-body separation thing. And it echoes back to the ancient Egyptians who associated that with the inner eye and inner seeing. But that pineal gland has been associated with the, quote, inner light, unquote. Among certain groups, particularly Africans, it is the least calcified. It tends to develop calcium over time, calcified. And with Asiatic peoples, there is less slightly more calcification rather. And in European peoples, it is the highest level of calcification. And some people have argued that with more calcification, there's less capacity to, quote, have spiritual experiences, unquote. I don't quite buy that, but I understand people's arguments. I don't buy it, but I understand the argument. Okay. Um, but in most spiritual traditions, getting in contact with that quote inner eye, that quote third eye, unquote, whatever you name for it, is intimately involved in the spiritual process. Jesus the Christ, the great avatar, says in the New Testament somewhere, I wish I could remember where, but he made a methodological statement, not only spiritual, but a method statement. He said, uh, when the eye is single, the body is full of light. When the eye is made focused and singled, the whole body is flooded with light. That's not only a testimony of spiritual revolution, it's also methodology. And that's why you find in many contemplative meditative prayer traditions, there's an emphasis placed on quieting the body and focusing inwardly, dropping the senses as much as possible, and trying to make contact with that innermost light. So it's a methodology. It's a methodology, and it was first discovered by the ancient Kemetic Egyptians, got on the trade routes. They've also discovered it, rediscovered it in Dravidian India and Tibet, the all-seeing eye of Tibet. So it's worldwide. Nobody has an exclusive price on this, license on this. This belongs to the treasury, the inheritance of everybody. This is your inheritance. And I would hazard a guess, an intuition, that a future humanity, many years from now, this will be common knowledge, and this will be something that we're all invested in, just like learning how to speak or to walk or to talk, to be how to make contact with that innermost self. We are still evolving as a species, and we're all evolving as a species based on an African template, and all the other variations of human beings are variations of this African template. I spent the entire early part of our African unconscious obsessively detailing this, because it's important to know the African origin of human consciousness. The African origin of human consciousness. Let that sink in. And yes, deep meditation can bring about a bright light sensation. Yes. Absolutely yes.
Dr. Bynum, this has been, I mean, I always appreciate talking to you and hearing from you. Is there anything before we wrap up that that I haven't invited you to share, or that you would want us to follow up on? Is there anything about?
Well, I would hope that with the time that I have left, I'm able to continue doing this work, because it is critical for me. As I said, the book Dark Light Consciousness, I didn't hold anything back. It's doing quite well. I'm very pleased. And it's now an audio book. So you don't have to sit, because it's, and read it. It's dense in places. But when you hear it, it's like our conversation right now. You hear it and it's like, oh yeah, right, I get it. Okay. And this summer, I've expanded the African unconscious into our African unconscious, the Black origins of mysticism and psychology. Those two and a couple of others, I'm hoping, will help us move from this frozen place to a place of more acceptance of who we are, and less fear, and a recognition that even though there may be setbacks, and are setbacks, i.e. the recent political debacle, that we are on a trajectory that we've been on for hundreds of thousands of years, and our destiny is a luminous one. It really is. I'm very optimistic about the human future. I really am.
Look, let's end on that wave. I appreciate that, and why offer up any other response or challenge to that. Let's let that take us out. Dr. Bynum, thank you so much again for joining us this morning.
Well, I've appreciated it very much, and appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk and to reach out to folks, and people take it and then let that work its own way into you, and then you take it and improve on it in your own particular way.
Right on. And please, I hope you're willing to come back because I don't want it to be too long before we do this again. And
That'd be great. Yeah, I think Zooming has been wonderful.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks again, Dr. Bynum. We appreciate your work. Thanks for joining us. Take care. Okay. All right. So listen, everybody, thank you for joining us this morning. Really appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Consider hitting that join button and joining this channel because much more is coming with the channel, much more collaborative work, expanding on these projects. So your support will be of great help to that if it's at all possible. At least like, share, and subscribe. imixwhatilike.org for more. And we'll keep the conversation and the work going. Thanks again for joining me and joining us. The comments in the chat have been great. We really appreciate it. And those seeing it on the replay, we look forward to hearing what your thoughts are as well. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. And we'll catch you next time right here at I Mix What I Like Live.